Topic 15, the Articles of Confederation. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking, as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to explain what the Articles of Confederation were and why it was needed. List 3 accomplishments of the U.S. government under the Articles, as well as 3 failures, and analyze the impact of Shays Rebellion on the decision to reform and eventually discard the Articles of Confederation in favor of a new constitution. After the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, the Second Continental Congress that was acting as the 13 colonies' government recognized the need for a declaration that would proclaim their independence from Great Britain. This document, of course, became the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia and signed by members of the Congress on July 4, 1776. The Second Continental Congress also recognized that the fledgling nation required another document that would establish systems for how the 13 previously independent colonies would band together into a single nation and for how that nation would interact with foreign countries. This document became the Articles of Confederation. Although the Congress began drafting the Articles in June 76, it did not finish debating, editing, and approving them until November of the following year. The state's final ratification occurred on May 1, 1781, only a few months before the War for Independence ended. The Articles continued to serve as the U.S.'s governing document until it was replaced by the Constitution in 1788. Its short life, especially relative to the longevity of the Constitution, implies that the Articles contain significant weaknesses. Before we list and explain some of these weaknesses, though, let's examine some of their successes. First, the United States successfully negotiated the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war for independence against Great Britain while the Articles were in effect. Moreover, under the Articles, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which established an equitable practice for the entrance of new states into the Union, accepting territories as states equal to the original 13 once they attained enough inhabitants. This precedent allowed the U.S. to continue growing westward as a unified nation. Finally, the Northwest Ordinance also prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territories acquired from Great Britain in 1783. This territory includes the present-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. While the Supreme Court's decision in the 1857 case of Dred Scott would invalidate this prohibition, the 70-year ban on slavery that the ordinances proclaimed allowed a tradition of free labor to take root across the entire northern swath of the country in the decades following the Revolution. Despite these accomplishments, however, the Articles of Confederation never established a government strong enough to enable the new nation to thrive. Wary of strong centralized authority after living as British colonists during the 1760s and 70s, the men who wrote the Articles crafted a government that allowed each state to retain a great deal of autonomy or independence. Congress lacked the power to demand taxes from the states, and so when the states did not fully meet the Congress's request for funds, Congress had to print more money. As a result, the U.S.'s currency became so depreciated that it's rumored that another way to say that something was worthless was to complain it's not worth a continental, or the currency during that time. Nor would the Congress impose a draft. Any troops that states sent to the war effort were entirely voluntary. Finally, there was no president nor national judiciary under the Articles of Confederation. Foreign emissaries, like John Adams, also had a difficult time procuring favorable trade agreements for the United States when he could not promise that each individual state would not act in its own distinct interest. Ultimately, the Articles of Confederation failed to provide for a way that the central government could force the states to act in the best interest of the nation. The Articles' many weaknesses were highlighted in Shays Rebellion in western Massachusetts in 1786-87. Thanks to the depreciated continental currency, as well as the difficulties of the post-war economy, Massachusetts's eastern merchants and bankers began requiring hard currency. In other words, they stopped allowing their strapped neighbors to buy on credit or with worthless paper money. When farmers in the western part of the state could not fulfill their debt and tax obligations, they began to lose their land and possessions. To make matters worse, some of these farmers, such as Daniel Shays, were Revolutionary War veterans who had received little pay during the war as well as no pensions after, and believed that the state and national authorities owed them this back pay and pensions for their military service. From late summer through the autumn of 1786, small bands of these aggrieved farmers started showing up at courthouses throughout New England and prevented local courts from meeting, thus stemming the loss of farmers' property to creditors. Elites from Boston, terrified of the breakdown in law and order, as well as of the financial losses that occurred from it, issued arrest warrants for the leaders of the protest in late fall. This action, as well as others prohibiting speech critical of the government and allowing it to put dissenters in jail without a trial, led opponents to organize a complete overthrow of the Massachusetts government by January 1787. Daniel Shays and Rebellion co-leader Eli Parsons led a force of some 1,500 men to overtake a federal armory at Springfield on January 25th. The central government had been unable to recruit enough soldiers to guard the armory, so a general from the Massachusetts militia did so without authorization from the federal government. While the Massachusetts militia eventually put down the rebellion, its very emergence highlighted to many the need for a stronger central government, one that could better regulate the economy so that the conditions that caused the rebellion would be prevented in the first place, and one that could muster an army so that if and when future armed dissent erupted, it could be put down at once. After years of calling for the reform of the Articles, George Washington himself wrote a letter about Shays Rebellion in which he demanded, "Let us have a government by which our lives, liberties, and properties will be secured." The Articles of Confederation, he believed, did not create a central government strong enough to live up to the promises of the Declaration of Independence, written just 11 years earlier. In the following podcast, we'll hear about how state representatives returned to Philadelphia in May 1787, just months after Shays' Rebellion ended, to attempt reforming the Articles so that it would fulfill Washington's hopes and the Declaration's intent. For now, though, remember the learning objectives for this podcast. Try to write each one out in a sentence or paragraph now. If you find that you can't do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives on the screen now. Good luck!